Hey guys, welcome to Anatomy and Physiology 1, Lesson 1. In this lesson, I'm going to introduce you to the origins of anatomy and physiology, the most common terms in describing location and structures in anatomy, and give you the basic knowledge of how the human body is organized. Now, mastering the foundation of anatomy and physiology will not only give you an understanding of how your body works, but will also give you a foundation to help others in the future. So let's start by talking about what anatomy and physiology is. So to do that, we have to define the terms anatomy and physiology. Anatomy comes from the Greek meaning to cut open. It's the study of the structure of the body. Remember that term, structure. This means how the body looks, how it's organized, and how it's structured. Think of this as the physical properties of the body. Now, physiology comes from the Greek meaning relation to nature. It's the study of how the body parts and systems function. That's the key word, function. Think of physiology as how the body moves and what actions it takes within its own environment. So, the origin of anatomy. There is a long and interesting history of the origin of anatomy. Experts actually believe that the earliest examinations of the human body probably began with those who were sacrifice victims. The earliest evidence of anatomical examinations were actually documented in early 1600 BC by the Egyptian people. There are many Egyptian paintings, scrolls, and artifacts like the one that's shown here that show anatomical diagrams of the organs and blood vessels. This indicates that even early on, when people died or when they sacrificed people to the gods, they were paying attention to what the body looked like, both on the inside and the outside. Throughout time, our ancestors were focused on how the body works in an effort to combat illness and injury. So as healers and physicians emerged in society and culture, the need to understand the body grew. These early medical workers observed the effects of injuries and watched how wounds healed. They examined the dead bodies to determine cause of death, and they were looking to get a greater understanding so that they could keep people well. The greatest growth in anatomy actually occurred during the time of Hippocrates in 400 BC. Hippocrates was a Greek physician who studied anatomy and actually coined the principle of physiology. He was known as the father of anatomy. He was the first person to document a belief that diseases were caused naturally and not because of superstition or because of the wrath of God. We rely on the work even today of Hippocrates, as the Hippocratic Oath that is taken by physicians is based upon his work and his philosophies. The second greatest contribution to anatomy came from Galen of Pergamon. He was in 200 AD. Galen was also a Greek physician who wanted to build upon the work of Hippocrates. Galen conducted numerous dissections of animals. Particularly, he liked dissecting monkeys and pigs in order to develop some anatomical models. Now, Galen's most well-known work comes from the book De Humana Corpus Fabrica, which I'm sure I didn't say right, but it's Latin, which is the first ever printed illustrations and descriptions of the human anatomy. Galen and his fathers also coined the first anatomical terms that are based upon the Greek and Latin language. These Greek and Latin suffixes and prefixes are still what we use today in medicine. And you will see in your study materials that there are a list of our most common prefixes and suffixes that we still use. After Rome fell and Europe entered the Middle Ages, a dark age also fell over anatomical studies. So desecration of the human body after death was forbidden during this period. and cadavers could no longer be used for study. So during this time, the knowledge of anatomy kind of stood still. However, in the early 20th century, as higher education institutions began to train physicians, the dissection of cadavers began to be used again. Physicians would travel from auditorium to auditorium, learning as much as they could through human dissection. England became the center for anatomical research, and in 1832, an Act of Parliament in the United Kingdom was put in place that allowed physicians and instructors of anatomy to dissect donated corpses. This was in response to a growing illegal trade that was going on that had begun in corpses and prevented the actual stealing of bodies from cemeteries for a profit. In 1858, Henry Gray, a lecturer of anatomy at St. George's Hospital Medical School in London, published the first ever anatomy textbooks for medical students. This textbook continues to be published today, with the latest edition being the 41st edition, which was published in 2015. You know this book as Gray's Anatomy. So let's talk about anatomy today. With the expansion of technology, we now know a lot of detail at anatomy at the cellular level that we never knew before. Back in the day, it was what you could see with the human eye and what you could see move. Now, with the use of 3D modeling, CAT scans, X-rays, MRIs, and genetic testing, we can see anatomy in a whole new light. We can see the fine details all the way down to the atoms and the molecules in our body and what they do. In addition, with the growth of health-related research and studies, we now have more information around molecular biology, which is the biological activity that's occurring between molecules in various organ systems. This knowledge of genetic and molecular biology has assisted the science community with understanding the relationships between cells, DNA, RNA, proteins, and the regulation of all those actions. There's something called assays, which is an investigative procedure that allows scientists to measure the actual functional activity of a cell. This has also provided greater detail into the contents of organic samples from the body. There are ways now that we can stain and look at cells under a microscope, actually see them moving, and be able to see all the individual organelles of the cells. But one of the greatest contributions to anatomy in the modern world is the availability of knowledge to spread worldwide through the internet. The ability to share information immediately has greatly improved the access of our quality anatomical resources. An example of this is found in the Visible Human Project, which is done by the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and it is publicly available. It is an anatomical repository of cadaver images and cross-sections. I encourage you to check it out, and the link is there provided for you. So, the human body is organized into essentially 9 different levels. I'm going to talk to you about it from biggest to smallest. Some teachers prefer to teach it from smallest to biggest, and some may combine some and leave some out, but essentially these are the main 9 levels. If we start from biggest to smallest, it's the organism. In this case, we're talking about the human organism, but it could be a dog, a cat, a mouse, anything that's the whole unit. The organ system is next, and then following that is individual organs, then individual tissues, individual cells, the organelles that are within cells, the macromolecules that make up organelles, the molecules that make up macromolecules, and the atoms that make up molecules. And there is a quick overview on all these levels of organization in your study materials, but we're going to go into depth and talk about each one of them individually. So let's start with the organism. So in this case, the organism we're referring to is the human body. Like I said, in science, the organism may be an entire pig or dog, but essentially, an organism is the entire working unit, comprised of a group of organ systems working together. So now let's talk about those organ systems. So, the human organism is comprised of 11 organ systems. Again, some people you talk to may combine these, or the names might be slightly different. But essentially, these 11 systems are made up of groups or organs that function closely together towards a common goal. These organs form a system. While the names of these systems, again, may slightly vary among the medical community, their functionality and descriptions are essentially the same. The systems that we're going to study in particularly include the integumentary system, which has the main functions of protection and temperature regulation, the muscular system, which assists in movement and support, the skeletal system, which provides protection, support, and also provides blood production. We'll talk about that specifically later on. The nervous system, which is the communication network and the center for all messages throughout the body. The endocrine system, it assists the nervous system with communication through message delivery. The circulatory or cardiovascular system, you'll hear it one way or the other. It carries blood and nutrients throughout the body. The lymphatic system, which works to transport fluids and fats and defends the organism against disease. The respiratory system, which exchanges gas as well as filters and transports air through the body. The digestive system, which breaks down food and nutrients for absorption and use. The excretory or urinary system, responsible for maintaining pH and volume of body fluids as well as excretion of waste, and the reproductive system, which gives the organism its ability to produce offspring. There also is a handout under study guides that breaks these apart into detail, gives you some idea of what organs are involved, but you can kind of see that through this diagram. But I do encourage you to look at that and study that a bit, because you'll probably see some questions about that later on. So let's talk about now the actual organs. So organs are individual structures within organ systems that have specific functions. Each organ within a system is comprised of a group of tissues, which we'll get into next. But you can see in this picture, these are different organs. Each one comes from a different part of the body, depending on what organ system we're talking about. But these individual organs that you see, such as the lungs, the heart, the kidneys, the brain, the liver, the stomach, the colon, the pancreas, the spleen, all these organs that you see in this picture apply to a certain organ system. Like the heart applies to the cardiovascular system. The kidneys are going to apply to the urinary system. The stomach's going to apply to the digestive system. Every one of them has their own function and their own purpose within a system. So again, we talk about organs being made up of groups of tissues, so now we're going to talk about specifically tissues. So tissues are groups of cells, which have assembled into layers or masses with the intent to serve a specific function. There are 4 types of tissue. That's epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. When we get later on into our 3rd lecture, we'll talk a lot about tissues and these 4 specific kinds and what they do and where they're found. But for now, just know that tissues are groups of cells and there are 4 different kinds. So let's go to the next level, which is the cell. And I group mine together into cells and organelles. Some places kind of breaks it together. But in our lectures, we'll talk about them as together as one thing. So The cells that make up tissues are considered the basic structural, functional, and biological unit of life.